80% of American startups building on open source AI are doing it on Chinese models right now. That is not a rumor. That is an Andreessen Horowitz data point. And to put that number in perspective, that is a larger share of the market than Google and OpenAI combined hold among that same group of companies. You heard that right. But here is the part that blows people's minds. That statistic is not even the real story. The real story is what is happening inside the companies that will never say it out loud. The Fortune 500 boardrooms, the Silicon Valley product teams, the government contractors, and why the silence around all of it is just as revealing as the switch itself. That story starts with the price. The price that broke the market. Picture your electricity bill doubling every year. Not because you are using more power, because the utility company can, and nobody has built an alternative yet. That is what the American AI pricing model has looked like for the last 3 years, and for most businesses, it was just the cost of doing business in the modern world. Then the alternative arrived. Here is the number that every business owner in this video needs to sit with. The same workload, same inputs, same outputs, same benchmark performance that costs you $1,500 a month on Claude Opus costs $35 a month on DeepSeek. Read that back. $1,500 versus $35. That is a 43-to-1 price difference. And to anchor that for you, if a cross-country flight costs the same as a cup of coffee, that is roughly the gap you are looking at. You heard that right. Now here is what most people get wrong about that number. They hear it and they assume there must be a quality trade-off hiding somewhere, a catch buried in the fine print, a performance cliff that shows up the moment your use case gets complicated. That is the reasonable assumption. That is also not what the data says. Stanford's AI index benchmarked DeepSeek against America's best models. The performance gap was 2.7%. 2.7. That is not a trade-off. That is a rounding error dressed up as a competitive disadvantage. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. When you are a startup, burning venture capital, or a mid-sized company with a CTO who answers to a CFO, a 43-to-1 price difference does not feel like a discount. It feels like your previous vendor was committing financial malpractice. It reframes every invoice you ever approved. It makes the last 3 years of AI spending look like something you are going to have to explain to your board. And that is exactly what started happening inside American companies. Quietly, without press releases, without LinkedIn announcements, one procurement approval at a time. Airbnb did not hold a press conference. Their CEO summarized the decision to move customer service AI to Alibaba's Qwen model in 3 words: good, fast, cheap. That was the entire strategic rationale for one of the most recognizable consumer brands on the planet, shifting its AI infrastructure to a Chinese model. 3 words. Because when the math is that lopsided, you do not need a white paper. You need a signature. Pinterest did not announce anything either. They rebuilt their entire recommendation engine, the algorithm that decides what 150 million monthly users see when they open the app on Chinese open source models. The result was 30% more accurate recommendations at 90% lower cost. 90%. That is not optimization. That is a completely different economic reality for a company that lives and dies on engagement. But here is the brutal catch. Neither of those companies wanted you to know. And the reason they did not want you to know is not technical, it is not legal, it is political. And that political problem is the second layer of this story, because the silence is not accidental. The companies that made the switch are not staying quiet because the decision was wrong. They are staying quiet because in the current geopolitical climate, telling your customers that your core infrastructure runs on Chinese technology is the one thing your PR team will never let you put in an earnings call. And that calculation, the gap between what companies are actually doing and what they are willing to say publicly, is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because it turns out the rebrand was already waiting for them. The rebrand nobody noticed. You have probably used a Chinese AI model this week without knowing it. Not because you went looking for one. Not because you made a deliberate choice to cross some geopolitical line. But because the tool you opened, the platform you logged into, the assistant built into the software your company pays for every month, it did not come with a label that told you what was running underneath it. Think of it like a grocery store brand. The packaging says one thing, the factory it came from says another. You never see the factory. That is the architecture of how Chinese AI entered the American market at scale, not through front doors. Through white label agreements, third-party API wrappers, and rebranded SaaS platforms that sit between the user and the underlying model like a frosted window. The product looks American. The pricing looks competitive. The underlying engine is something your IT department never approved and your legal team never reviewed. Here is the part that nobody talks about. Cursor is currently the most popular AI coding tool in America. Developers love it. Engineering teams swear by it. It has become the default environment for a generation of programmers who grew up writing code with AI assistants. And earlier this year, researchers discovered that Cursor was routing queries through Kimi K2-5, a model built by Moonshot AI, a startup headquartered in Beijing, without disclosing that to its users. This was not a data breach. It was not a hack. It was a product decision. A business chose the model that performed best at the price point that made sense, and the underlying origin of that model was not something they put in the changelog. Now here is what makes this bigger than one company. Cursor is not an outlier. It is an example of a pattern playing out across hundreds of tools simultaneously. The market for AI infrastructure is not a market most users ever see. It operates one layer below the thing you actually touch. And at that layer, the economics of Chinese models are so overwhelming that the question is not whether a tool is built on them. The question is whether the company building the tool bothered to tell you. Most did not. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. The open-source nature of many Chinese models makes this structurally invisible. When DeepSeek releases a model under an open license, any developer anywhere can download it, rename it, wrap an interface around it, and ship it as their own product. There is no transaction to trace. There is no API call that routes back to a Chinese server. The model lives locally, on American infrastructure, inside an American product, and carries zero indication of where it originated. This is not a loophole. It is a feature of how open-source software works. But it means that the 80% figure from Andreessen Horowitz is almost certainly an undercount. Because it only captures the companies that know what they are building on. It does not capture the companies using a tool that is itself built on something they never investigated. And the people who understood this earliest, the engineers, the product leads, the CTOs, who saw the architecture clearly, most of them said nothing, not because they were told to stay quiet, but because the tools worked, the cost dropped, and nobody above them was asking the question. That silence has a cost. And part of that cost has already been paid by your data. Your data already left the building. There is a clause in most AI platform terms of service that almost nobody reads. It is not hidden. It is not written in a different font. It is just long and boring and positioned between two other paragraphs that are also long and boring. And buried inside it, in language that sounds administrative, is a sentence that describes where your data goes when you use the platform. For a lot of tools built on Chinese AI infrastructure, that sentence describes a journey your data takes that your IT department never approved, your legal team never reviewed, and your executive team almost certainly never discussed. Think of it like mailing a letter. You write it, you seal it, you hand it to a courier. But the courier's route takes it through a sorting facility in another country before it reaches its destination. The letter arrives, the job gets done. But somewhere along the way, someone else had access to the envelope. Here is what most people never think about. Enterprise companies using AI tools are not just running customer queries through these systems. They are running internal documents, strategic plans, financial models, HR records, legal correspondence, the kind of information that would appear in a court filing or a regulatory disclosure if it became public. When that data passes through infrastructure governed by a different legal system, one where government access to private company data is not a warrant process, but a policy question, the exposure is not theoretical. It is structural. Now here is the part that genuinely stops people cold. Many of the companies that made the switch did not do a thorough legal review before they did it. They did a cost review. The 43-to-1 pricing difference landed on a spreadsheet, it got approved, and the data started moving before anyone on the legal team had read the terms closely enough to understand where it was going. By the time IT departments in several major organizations flagged the routing behavior data packets traveling through servers in jurisdictions outside the United States, the volume of internal information that had already passed through those systems was not small. We are talking about months of enterprise workflows, hundreds of thousands of queries, documents that, in some cases, carried confidentiality designations. Here is what makes this incredibly difficult. There is no clean line between negligence and rational behavior when the price difference is 43-to-1. A procurement officer approving a tool that costs 90% less than the alternative is not making a reckless decision. They are making the financially defensible one. The problem is that financial defensibility and data security are not the same calculation, and most organizations are structured in a way where the person running one calculation never talks to the person running the other. And the people who were supposed to build the guardrails, the lobbyists, the legislators, the regulators, tried. They spent billions trying. And the rules they produced had more holes than a policy document has any right to have. That is the next part of this story, and it is not flattering for anyone involved. The lobbyist firewall that failed. Washington noticed. To be fair to the people inside the system, they noticed faster than Washington usually notices anything. By late 2023, there were briefings, there were hearings, there were executive orders with language specifically designed to limit the creep of Chinese AI into American infrastructure. The intention was real. The execution is where the story gets complicated. Think of it like building a fence around a property, but leaving the gate unlocked. The fence exists. You can point to it. You can tell people the property is protected. But anyone who knows where the gate is can walk straight through. The fence Washington built was called executive guidance, procurement restrictions, and a patchwork of agency-level rules that applied clearly and unambiguously to direct government use of Chinese AI tools. Federal employees could not use DeepSeek on government devices. Certain contractors working on classified systems were prohibited from deploying models with Chinese origin. The rules were real, and in the narrow category they covered, they had teeth. Here is what most people get wrong about what happened next. The rules were written for the front door. The Chinese AI market entered through the side window. The moment a model is released as open source, it is no longer a Chinese product in any legal sense that American procurement rules are equipped to handle. It is a piece of software. It has a license. It lives on American servers. And nothing in the executive orders that existed as of early 2026 gave a procurement officer a clear legal basis to reject it. The lobbyists who fought for stronger restrictions, and there were serious, well-funded efforts from American AI companies who understood exactly what was happening, ran into the same structural problem every time. Writing a law that bans a Chinese AI model without also banning the open-source ecosystem that model participates in is genuinely difficult. The models do not come with flags, they come with license files. And a license file does not tell you who wrote the underlying architecture or where the training data came from. Here is the brutal catch. The companies lobbying hardest for restrictions were the same companies whose pricing had created the conditions for the switch in the first place. OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, these are organizations that spent years building pricing structures that were sustainable for enterprise customers with large budgets and essentially inaccessible for everyone else. The market they left unserved is the market Chinese AI captured. The lobbying effort was, in a very real sense, asking the government to protect a pricing model that the market had already rejected. And the government, to its credit, was not entirely willing to do that. So the rules stayed narrow. The loopholes stayed open. And the companies that wanted to make the switch had all the legal cover they needed to do it quietly. But here is the detail that makes the lobbying failure almost irrelevant in the long run. Even if Washington had passed the toughest possible restrictions on Chinese AI, use restrictions with real enforcement mechanisms, real penalties, and real definitions that close the open source loophole, it would not have changed the engineering reality. Because the engineering reality is the part of this story that the lobbyists, the legislators, and most of the American technology press completely missed. China did not win on price because it subsidized its way to cheaper products. China won on price because America handed it the most powerful innovation incentive in the history of technology. America told China it could not have the best chips, and China responded by making the chips irrelevant. That is not a metaphor. That is literally what happened. And the technical story of how it happened is the one detail in this entire script that will make you stop and sit with it for a moment. The engineering story nobody told. America's plan was clean, in theory. If you control the most powerful semiconductors on the planet, the NVIDIA H100S, the A100S, the hardware that trains frontier AI models, you control the ceiling on what anyone else can build. Cut off China's access to that hardware, and you cut off China's ability to compete at the frontier. It was a technology blockade dressed up as an export control policy. And for about 18 months, it looked like it might work. Then DeepSeek published its technical paper, and the assumptions underlying the entire strategy collapsed in a single news cycle. Here is the part that engineers don't want to admit, because it makes the American semiconductor strategy look not just ineffective, but counterproductive. When you tell a world-class engineering team that they cannot have the tool everyone else is using, you do not slow them down. You redirect them. You force them to solve a harder problem. And sometimes, solving the harder problem produces a solution that is better than the one everyone else settled for because they never had to try. Think of it like a chef who runs out of the expensive ingredient. The dish they invent around the shortage is sometimes the one that ends up on the permanent menu. DeepSeek's engineers could not throw unlimited NVIDIA compute at their model the way OpenAI and Google could. So they rethought the architecture from the ground up. They built what is called a mixture of experts model. Picture a company with 256 ultra-specialized departments, each one world-class at a very narrow set of tasks. When a question comes in, the company does not wake up all 256 departments. It wakes up 8. The 8 that are most relevant to that specific question. Everyone else stays dark. 256 expert clusters, only 8 active at any given moment. You heard that right. And to anchor that, 256 is roughly the number of countries on Earth. DeepSeek built a model with a specialist for almost every country on the planet, and for any single query, it only ever needs 8 of them. That architecture does 2 things simultaneously. It slashes the computational cost of running the model because you are only ever powering a fraction of its total capacity. And it maintains performance at the frontier because the fraction that activates is precisely calibrated to the task at hand. Then they compress the working memory. Standard AI models carry enormous amounts of information in active memory during every single inference, every time they generate a response. DeepSeek's engineers found a way to compress that active memory by over 90%. 90%. That is the difference between a moving truck and a carry-on bag. Same destination. Fraction of the fuel. Here is what makes this incredibly exciting and slightly terrifying depending on which side of the Pacific you are sitting on. The reported training cost for the DeepSeek model that went head-to-head with America's best was $6 million. $6 million. GPT-4 cost an estimated $100 million to train. You heard that right. DeepSeek built a model that performs within 2.7% of America's best for 6 cents on the dollar. And they did it without access to the chips America assumed were the only path to that level of performance. Now here is the part that blows people's minds. The next version of DeepSeek is reportedly being trained entirely on Huawei chips, Chinese chips. Domestically produced hardware that did not exist at competitive scale 3 years ago and now apparently does. The semiconductor blockade that was designed to freeze Chinese AI at a specific capability level has produced, in the span of roughly 2 years, a Chinese AI industry that no longer needs American semiconductors to operate at the frontier. The fence is still standing. The property it was supposed to protect is on the other side of it now. And the money that figured this out before almost anyone in the West did is currently sitting in Hong Kong, waiting for you to catch up. where the smart money went. While Washington was writing policy memos and American tech journalists were debating benchmark scores, a different group of people was doing something more revealing. They were writing checks, very large ones, and they were writing them in Hong Kong. Here is the detail that puts everything into perspective. In the first quarter of 2026, Hong Kong raised $14 billion in equity sales, more than any other exchange on Earth. More than the Nasdaq, more than the New York Stock Exchange. The hottest IPO market on the planet right now is not in Silicon Valley. It is in a city most American investors stopped paying close attention to years ago. And almost everything driving that number is AI. Zhipu AI listed and climbed 524% in 43 trading days. To anchor that 524% in 43 days is a rate of return that most hedge funds do not achieve in a decade. Minimax, briefly, surpassed Baidu in market cap. Moonshot AI, the Beijing startup, whose Kimi K2-5 model was quietly powering Cursor, America's most popular coding tool, is preparing a Hong Kong IPO at an $18 billion valuation. Their IPO was oversubscribed 1,160 times. 1,160. That is not investor enthusiasm. That is a stampede. Now here is what most people get wrong when they hear those numbers. They assume this is speculative capital, tourist money chasing a hot sector, the kind of froth that shows up at the top of every technology cycle before the correction arrives. But speculative capital does not underwrite companies whose models are already running inside Fortune 500 workflows. It does not flow toward engineering teams that just demonstrated they can build frontier AI for $6 million. It flows toward stories. The money flowing into Hong Kong right now is flowing toward receipts. Here is the honest part, because this story deserves one. Chinese models carry political censorship on certain topics. Ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square, and the answer disappears. Ask it about Taiwan, and the language shifts in ways that are not accidental. That is a real limitation. For some use cases, it is a deal breaker. For the majority of enterprise workflows, customer service, recommendation engines, coding assistants, document processing, it is irrelevant. But you should know it is there. Regulatory risk is also real. Washington could move to restrict Chinese model usage in ways that actually have teeth. The rules that exist today have gaps. Future rules might not. Any company building core infrastructure on Chinese AI is carrying geopolitical exposure that does not show up on a balance sheet, but absolutely shows up when the political weather changes. And yet, a year ago, there was one AI playbook. Pay OpenAI. Pay Google. That was the entire menu. That consensus has now collapsed. The companies that found the alternative first are not talking about it. Not because the decision was wrong, but because in the current climate, admitting your business runs on Chinese AI is the one thing your PR team will never let near an earnings call. The switch already happened. The silence is just the last part to catch up.